Just
expressions. Yeah, sometimes
make sure that is sorted out. Okay, we're ready for the just had to create a new event, publicize it in places we've publicized it. Just a few more pages.
I suspect most people are going to watch the video later.
Right, we can start now, I think.
So how do we start? You start with an introduction.
Oh, sorry, start the...
No, sure, just start.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Yes. Anna. Okay. Sure.
Everyone knows you, so.
Okay.
Right. You can just hold it like you can just hold it like in the old days.
Perfect. Good idea.
Like here. Yeah.
Good idea.
Okay. Ready?
Okay. Hello, everybody. Today, we welcome Peter Bartle to UCLU Socionics Society. Peter Bartle has been doing socionics since 2005. So now Peter's going to become an expert in socionics and history. So without further ado, I welcome Peter Bartle to talk to us today about socionics and history. Please clap.
Okay. Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, is it slides? Hmm? Yeah, the slides, yes. Okay, yeah, it's better for me. Hmm? If I just, okay. Okay, hi, thank you. Yes, first, I'm not an expert, just an amateur, both in history and in socionics. A profession, I'm a chemical engineer. I just got into history for a long time, just because to understand, or try to understand the world a bit more. And when I got into socionics, and I saw the theories about socionics and history, I thought, okay, maybe there's something to it. And I like to use socionics to understand a bit more historical events, historical people. We can use that in several ways. One way is to try to type historical characters and see if by getting their types, you can understand what they do, what they did, and solve some historical mysteries. You can also use socionics to try to develop better theories for specific historical events. One favorite of mine is the Mutiny of the Bounty, for instance, if anybody hears about it. And there is then the Goulienka theory of quadra progression, which is what I'm going to focus now. To be honest with you, the theory of quadra progression is at the same time obvious and at the same time imperfect. But on the other hand, I think it does provide some insight, not explanation. It provides an insight into how historical events may occur. Now, this graph already shows pretty much what the quadra progression theory is. It is simply this, could it be simpler? Alpha to beta to gamma to delta back to alpha. That's it. That's the end of it. Now, of course, what Gulenka meant is that, because he wrote a few papers elaborating on that, is that alpha is actually sort of pre-civilization period, if you start from zero, because to have a civilization, you have to have a state. And alpha, because does not have force, does not have extroverted sensing, it lacks the foundation of a state. So alpha would be the beginning of a culture where you start to develop things like language and common costumes and common traditions, but is not really yet what you'd call a civilization. By the way, a guy made a series a few years ago, well, quite a few years ago, called Civilization, and he suggested that one way to differentiate a civilization from a culture is that a civilization has a sense of permanence, a sense of history, right? If a civilization of a culture has a sense of common memory, like, okay, we exist since such time, have common legends, we can remember previous kings, etc., that's civilization. But if it's a culture, like the Neolithic cultures, like some tribes, where you live from generation to generation, you can have traditions and you can have rituals, but you don't have a civilization, right? So that's one way of putting it. And this sense of permanence is precisely what you get when you have the extroverted sensing combined with introverted intuition, right? A sense of permanence, a sense of mission. And what happened, and from alpha to beta, I'll go back to that later, the main transition is that it is when a culture, which may be just a tribe of some sort, develops a sense of cohesion, a sense of collective mission, which leads to founding a state. Now, the most basic founding of a state is simply this. We are here together, and I say, okay, we have to do something together, might be to fight an enemy, or might be to solve a crisis, and you do as I told, because otherwise I'll beat you up or even kill you. That's the basic foundation, right? That's the street gang foundation of a state, right? My legitimacy of being the boss is simply because if you don't like it, I'm going to beat you up, right? That's the basic foundation of a state, isn't it? Obviously, this foundation has some problems, like somebody then trying to beat me up or kill me. And it becomes slightly more sophisticated when the boss, the person creating this state, starts to create the other alternatives, the source of legitimacy. For instance, maybe I'm the leader because I have a direct connection to the gods. Maybe I'm the leader because my ancestors were leaders, so I am sort of special, right? Maybe because I have a sense of leadership and you trust my leadership, right? So, and all of this is also characteristic of the beta quadra. Have a sense of vision, a sense of strength, a sense of structure, which gives a cohesion to this state. And all of the states, when they start, whether it is the ancient Egypt or Sumerians or Chinese, etc., they start with this basic foundation, right? Now, and I forgot to mention, also according to history or to the theory, states or cultures can stay in one of those stages for centuries or millennia. For instance, I'll go back to that later, but ancient Egypt, the Egypt of the pharaohs, etc., it stayed at what I'd call essentially a beta state for millennia, right, without changing. And ancient tribes, like Amazonian tribes or in Tahiti, they stay in an alpha state for millennia as well. And what causes them to change from one to the other? Okay, I would suggest it is just sort of combination of historical events. Now, the change from beta to gamma is when whatever caused this state to be formed, whether it was a national emergency or an enemy or whatever, starts to become less important, and this sense of cohesive mission becomes taken for granted, and slowly individuals start to have their own senses of ambition, their sense of purpose, the sense of individual achievement or individual mission, individual greed starts to become more important than the collective, right? And it starts to become something more, well, in a way, more pragmatic. You are not so concerned about whatever the sense of mission. You're less concerned about what the guy who can talk to the gods is saying. You start to start concerned about number one, about what I'm going to do to make myself more prosperous, or my family, right? You become more individualistic, and that is a stage of economic expansion, right? And this is a state, for instance, of things like the Industrial Revolution, or I'll go back to that, the Republic of Venice or Phoenicians, where the economic progress, the accumulation of wealth, individual greed, you can say that, becomes more important than the foundation of the state, which was a beta stage. Now, and then once this stage sort of exhausted itself, because there is no economic progression to be more beta anymore, or because people get somehow fed up, or because it gets a sense of, I'll call it again, exhaustion, it moved to delta, where it is a more contented, exhausted, tired, if I may say so, state, but also more, maybe more peaceful, where you are, instead of this gamma expansion and enrichment and individuality, is a more settled down, calm stage, where you're more concerned about preserving resources than spending. That's a difference you have here. These two symbols means you have expansion of resources, there you have preservation of resources. But the delta stage, presuming, if you, according to the theory again, at some point, this sort of contented community tends to decline. Actually, these are the, tends to decline and eventually goes back to alpha in a different way, and then it goes back. Now, this is the theory of Goulienko. He himself didn't say it works necessarily like that all the time. Actually, I struggle to think of examples where it worked precisely like this. What actually happens in history, to the extent that you can think of these examples as being valid, is that you have reverses, you have civilizations who go to alpha to beta, then to gamma, then something takes them back to beta. Or as they go to delta, another civilization takes over, if sometimes violently, and brings it all to beta or gamma again, right? And so that, but also, when you talk about civilization, with something so simplistic like this, obviously, it's not very simple, right? This is more the broad brush figure. I mentioned the Egyptians or beta, and if you look at their culture from a zoom out point of view, right? Talk about the pharaohs, talk about the gods, talk about their economic, their societal structure. Yes, it is beta, but that's only part of it, because always, apart from this level where you have the pharaohs, the kings, the religion, the priests, etc., if you go what's happening on the ground, what you have is essentially peasants and people also worrying about just surviving, raising their families, etc. And one could argue at this level, it was already delta, if you, from a point of view, right? So all of that applies to a sort of broad brush view of a civilization, does not explain everything. And the more complicated a civilization gets, the more mixed up this is, right? You can see several trends. It still remains useful, in my opinion, right? But again, I mean, this is necessarily remains a simplistic way of looking at things. It doesn't mean my opinion is not useful. It is interesting. Now, I'm going to get more detail what I just said. So the transition from alpha to beta, extroverted intuition, introverted sensing, which is a way of making the best of the present, shifts into introverted intuition, extroverted sensing, into time and force. So this, as a sort of easygoing, let's make the best of the present, shifts into a collective sense of vision and of achievement still as a collective, right? So that's where the consciousness of a civilization shifts. Going back to ancient Egypt, that's when at some point the Neolithic guys were cattle headers by the Nile, who shift to the Nile just because the Sahara was getting unlivable. They at some point they started to settle around the Nile, and at some point they decided, okay, let's build a society based on a king and a chief and some of those gods, and get into what we know as ancient Egypt, right? And they became conscious. Okay, now we have a sort of civilization. And from beta to gamma, this collective sense of mission or vision, sense of mission and of vision, yields to individualism, a sense of your own destiny. We're not that concerned anymore about what the nation and the group is doing. You take it as sort of granted. You're more concerned about what you personally are doing, your achievement, your wealth, your family, your career, your CV, not so much what the whole is doing. And once you get to for that stage to delta, it is when that becomes sort of exhausted, maybe because you've already reached the top of it. The sense of individuality, of ambition, of greed softens into a sort of down-to-earth sense of community, right? You become sort of tolerant, small town kind of person. And that, supposedly at some point, could also reverse. The sense of community goes back into the soft collectivism of alpha, where that is the one way of looking to it. Another way, which I'm going to show here, then I'm going to give some examples. Another way of looking at the same thing. Alpha, these symbols like emotions and senses, extroverted feeling, introverted sensing, they shift into emotions plus extroverted sensing. So a sense of artistic joy, which was the alpha, shifts into forceful, peaceful passion, not peaceful, into forceful, passionate conquest. You shift from being the guys just enjoying life on an island to shift the guys who are going to go to the next island and kick them out so that you become their boss because you deserve it. And in beta to gamma, it is when this passionate conquest yields to pragmatic expansion enrichment. It is when you realize, okay, this idea of conquering or imposing your will into others by force reached a point, it makes more sense to trade, to get rich, to explore resources. And that eventually, when you realize that the expansion of resources is becoming difficult, sort of pointless, it shifts into preservation of resources, which is then delta. And finally, resources shifts into enjoyment of resources, which is alpha. And then you go back into this, supposedly into the circle. Now, I'm going to give some examples of history, which gives some images to what this might mean in reality. Well, or supposed reality, right? This is just a theory. Okay, so for instance, I mentioned alpha. These are Tahitians enjoying life. Well, actually, so this is from a movie, right? But let's give an example what alpha Quadra be like, right? They're enjoying, they don't really have, and actually this is not that far out, that different from what the 18th century's British sailors said about the Tahitians, people like Captain Cook. It was, or later the people of the Bounty. Essentially, they didn't have enemies. They had excellent weather all year long. They had plentiful water and coconuts and fish. They could enjoy life. They didn't really have to, and they had a sort of a state, but a very basic level, right? Another example, some Amazonian tribes, they had, those that didn't have yet clashes with enemies, they had a sort of very easygoing life. They didn't really have a boss. They had a shaman who was more of a healer and settler of disputes, but didn't really boss people around. And more importantly, maybe, they didn't really have a sense of family, right? Their family was the whole of the tribe. And how can I put it? Because of their, I'll be very old-fashioned, their loose morals, nobody knew who their biological father was. So who would raise the children would be the mother with her brother, because the biological father was irrelevant, because nobody knew who he was, right? Because it was very easygoing. And that was, in socionics terms, a devaluation of of relationships, of introverted feeling. And that, however, almost easygoing life, it falls apart the moment that this faces, like for instance, an enemy. Let's say another tribe meets this island and decides, that's very nice, I'm just going to kill them or enslave them and exploit their resources. Then they die, or they become more beta themselves. And eventually, this leads to beta cultures. And as I put in there, because it's very rich, because you had the pharaoh, which was the absolute ruler. He was also a living god. And okay, to which extent they believed there was a living god, that's not a story, but it was the official ideology. And he was also commander of the army. And it was the whole society of Egypt was very structured. It was a command economy, everything commanded by the state. The state tried to took care of everybody to the extent they could by keeping food for emergencies. They also taxed you to, I mean, I think peasants had to pay something like 60% of their crops to the state. And they kept in power, or kept in society for thousands of years. Well, I guess because they were content at some point, and because they had this idea, okay, the pharaoh is really the ruler, he talks like gods, and he defends from the enemies. Now, of course, if you have a state like that, you have the old story of fear-mongering, right? You have some enemies, but sometimes we know that the Egyptian state would exaggerate the dangers of the Hittites or whoever to justify their power, right? But that's all part of it. Even fear-mongering is not based on nothing, right? And that is, and the religion of the Egyptian state actually very complex. You know, they had the Book of Dead and exactly how it happens after you die, etc. And they have all their gods. It's very complex culture. All of that gives them a sense of higher meaning of spirituality, which at some level is more complicated. Some people might find more inspiring than just enjoying the alpha. Other people might say, this is too dramatic, too much rather have this. I mean, it depends. I try not to be judgmental, right? But when you have a situation of limitation of resources and potential or real enemies, this kind of structure is obviously more likely to withstand thousands of years than that one. What I said about Egypt applies to pretty much the ancient cultures of Mesopotamia, talking about all of those guys, Sumerians, Assyrians, Babylonians, all of those were essentially the same kind of beta structure. Now, I'm going fast forward a few millennia as an example. That is an example of a purely gamma culture. That's the Republic of Venice. The Republic of Venice, they had a weak state. I not have a graph here, but the Constitution of Venice was something terribly complicated. All of the point of it was to keep the people in charge weak and keep the power of the state essentially in the hands of the rich people, right? The oligarchy, which is actually quite wild. And the whole purpose of the Republic of Venice was whoever is rich get rich, who is poor can have a chance of getting rich. It was a purely trading nation, trading civilization. A lot of the things you take for granted today, like for instance, patents, intellectual property, it was the Republic of Venice that invented. It's hardly to think of Venice as a place where people worried about theological disputes or whether you were a Catholic or a Protestant. Actually, even Shakespeare in Othello, he models out Othello, who's a Moor. He was a general. He had his paranoia about not being accepted, but of course it was all in his head. The reality is he didn't care, right? It was, what mattered is you do the job and you help us to get rich. That was the Republic of Venice. That's purely pragmatic, purely gamma, and one might argue purely materialistic, purely selfish, purely superficial if you worry about spirituality. And this is a picture I just got on the internet. Obviously, this happens to be a place somewhere in Belgium, in the French Wallonie, where I lived. Well, not here, but I lived in Belgium. And that is Delta. It could be anywhere else in Europe. That is essentially a place where you can see these people, they probably don't have much money. They survive on some money. They have, they have maybe some some basic agriculture, but it is where they sort of got tired of something like that, and they just trying to minimize the efforts and minimize the resources. And that is the case, one could argue, of many places in Europe, right, where is not so much anymore about wealth creation or wealth expansion. It's about preserving resources and essentially enjoying your retirement, so to speak, right? That is, that gives Delta. In the popular culture, actually, a good vision of Delta is in the Lord of the Rings, the Shire, right? The Hobbits. That is a sort of Delta utopia. That's Delta. The Hobbits themselves, they're sort of alpha-ish, but the Shire as a place, that's the idea of Delta, which some people might find nice and enjoyable, other people might find boring, but that's it. Now, I'm going to focus on one particular civilization, which I like to pick, which is one of the things I like, but is also a civilization that was around for thousands of years, which I know very well, I think. And it shows some of the cycles, which I think is interesting. It's talking about Rome. So I'm going to go how this cycle was visible to some extent in the Roman civilization. And for instance, if you can see this in German, it's not because I read German, it's simply because the Germans, they seem to like this kind of stuff rather than in English. So sorry for that, but I think it's clear. That's the constitution of the Roman kingdom, not the empire, the kingdom. What's the 8th to the 6th century BC? That is when Rome was a place near today the Latium, maybe bigger than the M25 region, something like that. And it was, if you look into it, it was something similar to the Egyptian, in the sense that you have a king. The king was also the chief priest. He was aided by the Senate, which was a council of elders. It was the nobles. And here says the people here, what they have to do is to obey the king, right? And you have a very stratified society, plebeians and nobles and the army, but it all had to do with the king. And the king was essentially a military dictator and a priest, pretty much like the Egyptian pharaoh. And that form of civilization survived for about 150 years. Sorry, 800 to, yeah, about 300 years. And that was a time when they were continually struggling, fighting with neighboring nations. It was all the society was militarized. Everybody had to be a soldier, and everybody, they were struggling all the time against next door nations that could come and fight them and kill them, and sometimes they did. So it was a consistently mobilized society for a common purpose, which was survival and conquering. Now, at some point, this was so successful that especially the nobles, they start to get fed up with this guy. They got rid of the king, telling them what to do. And they created this, let's say, republic. Now, I'm putting this just to show how complicated it is. People can look into this in detail. Essentially, they replaced the king with several levels of magistrates, which were all elected for 1 year. And the point of this was to make sure nobody would have power enough to become a king again. They wanted to make sure that these guys were elected and they have power, but none of them could be the king. And they had they were elected by a very complicated levels of elections. They were skewed toward people with more money, but still everybody had a say. And the reason why I say this has become now more gamma, which is my point of this, they toppled the beta aspects of it and very pragmatically turned into gamma. For instance, as I said, the king was a sort of chief priest. He was the only one who could perform some rituals to talk to the gods. When the Republic got rid of the king, they actually thought, it is a good idea to get rid of this guy who can talk to the gods. Maybe not. So they kept one guy called the Rex Sacrorum, which was the king of the holies, whose only function was to perform these rituals, which the king did. But in order not to say that he's now still a sort of a king, they elected a magistrate, the Pontifex Maximus, who is now the title of the Pope, by the way, in Rome, he was elected, so he was above this Rex Sacrorum, just to show the Republic was in charge, even of this guy who talked to the gods. And in situations where militarily they're going to be in big trouble because of invasions, etc., they created the institution of the dictator. Dictator, it was called they called that the dictator. It has a position for 6 months. In a national emergency, they said, okay, this is not working. You, for 6 months, are going to be the dictator, as if you're a king. So this system, actually, in terms of logic, has zero logic, right? That's why I say to Morgama, it is a whole system invented by the bunch of aristocracy, like in Venice, to prevent the emergence of a king. And even these things like the priesthood or religiosity rituals, they sort of pragmatically adapted to their needs, right? And all of this system was worked to serve the interests of the people who achieved these positions, right? So they were not interested so much into this state. Their reasons to get to these positions were to prestige, money, and for the benefit of their family. Because to get elected to these positions, you have to spend a lot of money. If you weren't elected, you might get bankrupt. And all of these positions, well, at least the top ones, meant commanding armies, and you could get killed, right? You could get ruined. So why would these guys do that? They could take the chance, make the choice of staying at home and enjoy their estates. But they were ambitious, some of them did, but the more ambitious of them, they went into this rat race for the sake, not for the sake of a common sense of, not for the sense of common sense of purpose, not for the good of the state. It was all, okay, I'll go into that because by doing that, I'll get rich, I'll get more powerful, and so my family. And everybody knew that. But that was a way of them doing it together and preventing anybody from winning a game and becoming a king again. And this system lasted for 400 years. And that was the system under which Rome expanded from being a place about the size of Bengali 5 to conquering most Mediterranean, right? It was one of the most successful places. Yeah, it was under the Republic that Rome conquered the Mediterranean, not under the empire, as people may think. And as I said, the reason why it's called it's a gamma state, because even though, of course, they had a state. So what moved it was essentially the self-interest of a broad number of people, although it's still a minority, of course, talking about the elites. And by doing that, they almost by, not by coincidence, but almost by a secondary effect, they also expanded the power of the state as a whole. Now, that system had some problems, and which is what happens with this game of power, of ambition, of self-interest becomes too much. The stakes become too high. When when individuals become so powerful that in doing this cat fight, they wreck the whole state with them. So that's what happened. That's what caused with Caesar and these people. And this system almost wrecked the Republic, and they had to adapt it. So this is, I call it still a gamma, because this symbol of the first so-called emperor, the princeps, actually means first citizen. This is still more or less the same republican structure. Only now you have one individual who controls the army, who sort of steers that and prevents this fight, this rat race from wrecking the state. And one could argue, okay, this doesn't that make it more better, like the pharaohs, like the kings? At this stage, I would argue not really, not so much, because first, this was all extremely pragmatic, this was all very opportunistic, and everybody knew what was going on, right? It was like if you have a game of any sport, and you realize you have to need an umpire to set the rules, otherwise you cannot play the game. And this was the system that lasted for 200 years, and that system basically maintained the game where the rich people or the elites could pursue their own ambitions in terms of economic expansion, not for the good of the state, for the good of their families and for their own CVs of their careers. And that figure was sort of keeping that under control. Now, of course, the figure doing that, sometimes they were aware of what they're doing, sometimes they weren't aware, but that's not the story. So during this period, and that's why I call it a sort of a gamma period, or even a gamma delta period, believe it or not. This is just a figure of that, all of the Roman Empire, and these are the trade routes, and where the economic activity. The point I'm making is this, and that's why I'm saying it was a gamma delta society. All of this area, Mediterranean, was completely or almost demilitarized, right? It was essentially a place of free trade and free commerce, well, free and up to a point. And as far as the most people are concerned, there wasn't really any wars with armies, or even the state for them might be relatively unimportant. This state was served to keep the borders under control. And for the most people here, whoever might be the princeps, the emperor, was sort of irrelevant. It was a guy in a coin, right? And that is why I'm saying that this kind of phase could be argued. I would say, that's why I put here just P, just the extroverted thinking, just the pragmatism, because that was really what it was about, right? There wasn't really much of a ideology of a sense of the state. It was essentially about economic progress, and about you getting your life and your families on. Now, this stayed like this for about 200 years, until pretty much like in other situations, it collapsed under massive attack by external, with the so-called barbarians. And this led to a period of about 50 years where this system collapsed into anarchy and into political and military and economic chaos. So this system, which was a sort of not so much militarized and so much kept to a minimum, and you are pursuing your own goal, not so much about the whole, was unable to resist this pressure of external aggression from outside, pretty much like, in a way, the people from Tahiti. They couldn't resist some mean guys from the tribe. And the consequence of that was, after these 50 years, that this state became, had to revamp itself. And then, now, rather than before, now it became more beta, right? The constitution now is very different. I'll go back to that. Now, instead of having this republican constitution with a guy just sort of by the side controlling it, now you have a semi-divine figure of the emperor, Kaiser, and he very clearly, okay, he bosses, controls everything. And previously it said everybody was citizens, now they are subjects. And this, of course, is the predecessor of the medieval monarchies, where you had a king and everybody was subject, and the king was there, also appointed by God, to protect you from your enemies, right? So this is now how, again, this is now a sort of betaization again of society before. I'm going to, sorry, I want to, for my own amusement, actually, I want to show a couple of other things in that, if you indulge me. These two guys, these are of the early part I mentioned, the Principate, the emperors, right? This guy is the first Princeps, Emperor Augustus, and this is 200 years later, a guy whose nickname Caracalla. And I'm pointing them because they are all essentially politicians, right? With all their power, they're politicians. This guy was more like maybe a Tony Blair figure, and with all his power, he still felt the need to pretend or to act as if he was a regular guy. And this guy, he was more like a thug, but he still felt the need to pretend to soldiers, not people, that he was an ordinary guy. Oh, I just soldier just like you. They did not pretend or try to be divine figures. They tried to pretend, I'm just one of you. Pretty much like politicians today, right? I mean, politicians today, no matter how wealthy they are or how much of elite they are, they still felt the need to say, at the end of the day, I'm just a guy like you, right? And those in between who didn't understand that, and they tried to show off, actually, I'm a pharaoh, they were killed, or they were deposed, right? Caligula, people like that, when they didn't understand how the game was played, they were killed by somebody. And that's why I'm saying that during this period, it wasn't really a beta society, it was gamma, because the political ideology, the spin was, at the end of the day, these are regular guys who somehow they deserve to be the ruler because of their personal qualities, right? It didn't necessarily fool many people or everybody, but that was the spin. It was different from the spin of the king, who was a king because he talked to the gods, or the pharaoh because of the god. So during this period, it was, with all the authority these guys had, it was the culture was that they were essentially just one of you, one of us. So I'm just putting that, and that during this period. Now, I mentioned, sorry if I come back here, that this period wrecked this system because all of this system almost collapsed because of military invasions and civil war, etc. And it only survived from this when it was revamped into something more centralized. And something I find interesting is that you have these guys We know exactly what they look like. I mean, these are real people, individuals. There are many statues of them, coins. There is a statue of this guy in the British Museum as well, and also of him. And after this chaos, which proved the collapse of this gamma delta-ish society, they were replaced by this guys for a while. And I put in these figures there for my own amusement, because this is still Roman, right? But they not look Roman, do they? These guys look more like Mesoameric thing. And these four guys, these four statues, they are in Venice, in the corner of the San Marco Square. And this was a period where the whole of this government was structured in a very specific way. And what the culture is saying, what the originator of the system is saying, it doesn't matter who I am as a ruler. My personality doesn't matter. It matters only that we four are the rulers, because this time they had 4 emperors ruling all of it. It was a tetrarchy. And they are saying to these statues, whether we're not a regular guy, we are 4, doesn't matter what you look like. What matters is we're united, we rule the world. This globe means rule the world. They're united, and they are soldiers, and they're there to protect you and to rule you. So this whole structure moved completely from the spirit of what was before as a consequence of this complete disruption of society. And I'm saying this was logical, but force introverted thinking, but extroverted thinking, sorry, extroverted sensing. Because this was a sort of very hardline, top-down structure. We will restructure it, and that's what the way it is, and you do as you're told. What lacked there was the other side of beta, which was the more spiritual, the more emotional, the passion, the higher meaning. There was no higher meaning to this. The meaning was simply, we are putting a system because otherwise everybody will collapse, right? I'm exaggerating a bit. I mean, we know who these guys were: Diocletian, Maxentius, Constantius, Galerius, and they put their names into laws, etc. It's not as if they were anonymous figures, but the ideology was that it doesn't matter who they are, it matters only what they represent. And it was also this period that invented feudalism, right? It was this period that said that if you are a blacksmith, if you are a blacksmith, you only have one son, your son has to be a blacksmith. But your son says, oh, no, I'd rather join a traveling circus or a theater group. The state would say, no, you have to be a blacksmith. And it created serfdom. If you are a serf in a farm, you couldn't say, actually, I'm going to move to a job, another farm. Instead, you say, no, you have to stay, because at the end of the day, we are all together in this. We are all mobilized to a common. And they were successful in this. I'm basically saying they were authoritarian, but they were successful because they kept the state in place, and they kept this. They managed to revert to this collapse of society which was happening. And actually, I'm going to move away from that now. At least the originator of this, a guy called Diocletian, an LSI, by the way, he was completely sincere in this, I think, because he took this system even to himself, because he put a system saying, okay, any person can only remain in this position for 20 years. After 20 years, you have to retire. And he did. He retired to a place in Croatia, which still exists. He was the only one who did that. He's even being consistent. He said, okay, it doesn't matter who is in this position, and after 20 years, I'll retire. And he did that. However, this system, which lasted for 20 years, collapsed because the ambitions of the individuals was not really accounted for. And also, and that's the point I was making, as I said, this was a harsh pragmatic regime based only on strength and order, while act was the God thing, the divine thing, the spiritual thing, the higher purpose thing. These guys ruled exclusively by force. And that is a period exactly when there was the final great persecution of the Christians, because there's a lot of, the story of Christianity in Roman Empire is exaggerated. They weren't persecuted continuously. It was a very big inconsistency. But during this period, with all this authoritarianism, all bringing the society down to a very controlled state, they also said everybody has to fall into line according to the ordained rituals. So if you're not willing to burn incense to statues of the gods, you are part of the problem. So either you fall into line, or you have to, well, or you cut your head off or something like that. And that was a consequence, and that was a stage where there was a great persecution. Most of the people that you know of, martyrs of the Christianity, they were actually during the period of the Tetrarchy, of these four guys. And that, there was a, and then this period was succeeded by a guy who understood all this. And as I said, a guy who kept this system and actually improved it in putting the emperor as a divine figure. He basically put the divine into the system that was missing. And he created the spirituality that was missing. And basically what he did, he co-opted the Christians to give him the legitimacy, to put a halo there in his head, which then he created the system like the ancient kings, like the pharaohs, to say, okay, this is a society, we're all together for a common purpose, which is the protection of the state. I am the boss because I have a personal connection to God. So, the point I'm making, in a way, after all this, now we're talking about 1,000 years, we go full circle, in a way. This guy I'm talking about, that's my last slide, is the Emperor Constantine. And this I'm putting as a joke. This is a figure of Christ, which is in the British Museum. And if you look at his face, that's the same face, isn't it? You see the double chin, the eyes, the hair. And the fact is that Constantine, like Diocletian, he created a cult of personality. I am the ruler, like a pharaoh. He's a colossal statue there in Rome. And he had a personal identification with new religion. Sometimes he said he was the 13th apostle, and sometimes, subtly, he suggested that he was actually somehow, he was Jesus, right? Although this is something that later his sons play down, although historians today, they agree that he was essentially directly saying, okay, I am sort of identified with Jesus. So a sort of super pharaoh. And I point, okay, that's my last slide. And I put this to show that if you look into it, these elements here, they do explain, I think, how all the things go together, even at this high level. Okay, well, that's it. Hope it was interesting.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I want to know if there's any questions
about anything, not only about this. This is, of course.
Questions about this? Anyone has? I had an interesting question. Was despite the period described with Augustus and Caracalla being more of a force of relations, more idea of being a powerful figure, but still being relatable in some way to
Yes.
man.
Yes.
How would you say that, say, a more gamma like Augustus, as compared to a more beta figure like Caracalla?
As individuals?
Yes.
Well, okay, I mean, yeah, okay, I mean, that's precisely why I would say that one of the things regarding this Quadra thing, right, this Quadra progression, is that it takes a step back and the individual becomes less important than the type of the people involved becomes less important than the type of the culture, right? However, it's also true that it looks like when the type of the person in charge coincides with the type of the culture happening, the impact is stronger. So this guy, Constantine, was almost certainly an EIE. And I mentioned the boss of this structure, Diocletian. I think he was a very obvious LSI. If you even read his Wikipedia entry, you see he could only be an LSI. And and if you go here, yes, this system here was put together by this guy as an LIE, and that was a system that suited his personality best. But the system was put together in a way that was so stable that the personality of other people involved, the type of them, was less important. And if the type or the personality was too different, in the case of people like Caligula or Nero, as I said, the system would take care of that by having them killed or deposed, right? Actually, he also was killed in a very interesting way. He was killed by his bodyguard when he was behind a bush, leaving himself. Probably the most undignified murder of any of these guys.
What was the time when man was to death?
Sorry?
What was the time when man was to death?
What?
Time when man was to death, when he got shot through the stomach and he defecated as he died. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also,
yeah. No, okay. No, but I think the problem is the personality had a relatively little, small impact, right? That's the thing, right? So he wasn't interested in revamping the state or something, right? He was just there. He adapted the job to his own type, in that he preferred to be a soldier in the field and basically say to the soldiers, I'm one of you, rather than to say to civilians or politicians, I'm one of you, right? But he didn't try to revamp the state, except, as we discussed, he did revamp the state in a way, but okay, that's another discussion. Let's not get into there now, right? But a point I'm making is that the type of the individual, when you look into grammar, into Quadra progression, less important than the system. The Russians, some Russian sociologists, they, in my opinion, make this mistake. For instance, I mean, there is an article where they say that Yeltsin had to be an LAE and Putin had to be an ILI because of that point in the Quadra succession, moving from a beta period of the Soviet system to the gamma period of free market, which was absurd, right? I mean, I think you have to look at their types as individuals, not as their types for their supposed historical Quadra succession, because, yeah, what does that have to do with anything, right? So, okay, I mean, about anything else, you don't have to talk about these guys necessarily.
For historical period, how would you attribute the historical types of the American Civil War?
Of individuals, or about the
sites, north and south.
about solidity?
Confederacy and
What about the types
historically?
of the gamma period of the? Well, okay, I mean, you see if the Quadras can be applied to the Civil War. To be honest with you, I don't know if they can, right? Because the whole of the American system, right, can be called a gamma, right? Actually, the United States historically is probably the most gamma society in history. Now, the Civil War wasn't really about beta gamma thing. It was about a variation of economic system, which was if you have slavery or not slavery. Now, the point is that for the people who were, the point is that before the Civil War, actually, even the 18th century, for guys like Thomas Jefferson and Washington, Andrew Jackson, for those guys, slavery was actually, for pretty much all of mankind before that, slavery was just economic system, right? Today we see it as a sort of a social system of oppression, etc. And of course it was, but for their point of view, you have, for the guys of the South, you had cotton plantations, and their purpose was not, oh, I want to introduce a system that maintains slavery. Their purpose was to have the plantations going, right? It just happened that that the slaves were the economic system. I would argue that's a sort of hypothetical, but if somebody had said to them, okay, we abolish slavery, but instead of slaves, we're going to have a working tractor, would they say, no, I want to keep my slaves and I don't have a tractor? I mean, of course, that sounds absurd, right? So basically, slavery historically was never something to do with a system. It was just, you had slaves because you didn't have machines, right? And of course, what happened was, and that's, is that what happened was in the 19th century, starting here and then spreading to the States, there was a cultural shift, which you can call it in socionics, that's an interesting story, in that people started realizing that, okay, to actually force people to work against their will, or to sell them, etc., is immoral. And in the Civil War was a war because people of the South did not want to make this transition as fast as in the North making, because the North was industrialized, right? See what I mean, right? I don't see how to me, it sounds like a sort of two different, if you want to put it in terms of war, of Socionics, to me it seems more like two different sorts of gamma.
Really?
Yeah, because I don't see that's an ideology, really.
Well, the cultural.
It's cultural, yes, but the fundamental motivation of the culture of the North was for individual economic progress for the people who were wealthy, obviously, mainly, with an economic system who didn't have slavery, because for them it was more advantageous to have workers. And in the South, they were stuck in a system where it looks like the most efficient economic way was to have slaves, right? But it's not as if, of course, I mean, if you have a slave society, we start creating ideologies like, okay, they are slaves because because it's divided by God, or because that, but it's not really the motivation, right? Is it?
No, yeah. There are issues like the state rights and what South was depending, etc. And
Sorry?
Personal owner and this concept that are different.
The state rights.
Yeah, state rights and individual owner.
Yeah, no, sure, but I mean, okay, and arguably, from a pure legalistic point of view, the South had the right to succeed, right? It was just Lincoln who said, no, you don't, right? Whether he had the right to say that's not a story, but from a legalistic point of view, not a moral point of view, from what I know. But regarding states' rights, I think, I mean, look, I mean, I'm talking a lot, but I'm not a specialist, I'm amateur, right? But from what I've read, with all the talk of state rights, at the end of the day, their main complaint of this House was to be able to maintain slavery, right? All the issues was the state rights of the sort of loyalty argument, why motivation was to maintain slavery, right? And of course, and one could argue it was also sort of pointless, because I happen to have been born in Brazil, and Brazil actually was the last major country to abolish slavery. Only it was in 1888. So one generation after the Americans, without war, simply because the system exhausted itself, it became sort of pointless. Nobody was willing to keep it. And it was also abolished gradually, right? First, in 1860s, they said, okay, every child of a slave that's born from now is free, right? So that it was supposed to fade out until one day, 1888, when slaves were a minority population, they said, okay, let's just end it, right? And I think nobody disputes, I think that the South, if it had won the war, would also have run out of slavery one generation later, right? So, so it wasn't really I mean, I don't see that much of ideology or things behind it. Sorry.
So it's the same Quadra.
I think it's the same Quadra because, yeah, I mean, it was basically about one characteristic of the Gamma Quadra, right? And some people might say not the most attractive one, is this sort of me, right? I'm independent. I don't want the state to tell me what to do, and that was essentially the logic of the South, right? It wasn't so much, and actually, I mean, very few people in the South actually owned a slave, and it was the poor people of the South who ended up being killed and being killed and being cut to pieces by bombs, etc., or by cannons. And that is why in today this ideology, this political thing about when these people in the south of the states, my understanding is that they don't celebrate when they do celebrate the Confederate flag, oh, because we want to be slaves. No, we are glad that we resisted the invasion from these guys of the North. For them, the point of view, oh, we are doing defending slavery, is almost secondary. Is of course, it's not secondary for the police, you know what I mean, right? I'm trying to see it from that perspective, right? It wasn't about, no, we want to keep slavery. It was more about, we want us to do what you want, and we just happen to want to keep slaves. You see what I mean? You see what I mean? Maybe subtle, but that's a story. Does it make sense to you?
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
Sorry?
Like the Roman era, leading towards Venice, had a sense of a gamma. It also had a sort of revival, as it were, from the Industrial Revolution. Would you similarly pair off the Alpha periods?
Sorry, not following. Can you?
If you take elements of the Roman Empire, you could easily pair it off with another large gamma period, the Industrial Revolution. Would you say that there are any other instances where the Quadras can be paired off?
So, sorry, maybe I'm tired.
Like paired together, like you have a gamma period in the ancient world, you have a gamma period in the modern world.
Yes.
America, from the Industrial Revolution. Would you say that there's another period, another sort of pairing, where you have a beta in the ancient world, and you have a beta in the modern world?
Okay, well, I mean, okay, if you talk about look, I mean, every society that you have a state which at the end of the day is militarized and brings legitimacy from supernatural has beta characteristics, right? Now, I'll argue even today, I mean, the modern state in every country has beta characteristics, right? The American presidency has a beta characteristic, has a strong symbolism, right? Here in the UK, this beta symbolism is more in the monarchy. It is more image and the sense of history than actual real power. Not so much into the government, right? But it is still there, right? If you want to talk about purely, I mean, if you want to talk about hardcore beta periods, I mean, equivalent to what I said about the tetrarchs would be the communist period in Soviet Union, right? It was a similar period, right? Where what they gave them legitimacy wasn't divine as such, it was the firm belief in a sense of history. We are in the right sense of history because that's where history necessarily has to go, right? So that's what I'm talking about. Is that what you're leading on to the question?
Yeah, you see that beta sort of pulls into gamma in other periods. Say with Russia, it said that the Soviet system then went into a more of an oligarchy.
Yes, yeah, and arguably, okay, I mean, arguably, you're now getting into politics, but arguably, one could say that what happened in the Soviet transition to today is that what happened in Rome happened very quickly, in the sense that you had a beta state, which was the Soviet Union. That state essentially lost its sense of purpose because at the end, nobody really believed that they were in the story about we are in the right path of history. Everybody became cynical, and in the Gorbachev-Yeltsin era, or a period of toppling all that, in leading to a more individual, more free enterprise, and more self-interested era, which, however, because of the way it was made, led to this concentration of power in the oligarchs, maybe like these guys of the Roman Empire. And the Putin era was a reaction to that. I went back into beta to put these guys in line. And because in giving more of a sort of modern Russia kind of ideology, right? I mean, the Yeltsin, Gorbachev, they didn't have any ideology. Putin has a sort of patriotic modern Russia kind of vision, right? Although in his case, he has his legitimacy is not so much because he talks to the gods or because he has a mystical connection, because I probably hasn't thought of any. He's more, I am the leader because I'm a tough guy, isn't it? That's his whole image. Right? He's a guy who has a tough dog, who pilots jets and fights judo. That's his logic. He's like this guy in a way.
Or shall we do that? Okay. I'll just want to quickly check online if anyone's posted any questions.
Oh, okay, cool.
Just in case I may. They actually hear us. Tom, do you think they can hear us in this meeting? You can hear what people say. Well, I'll go up to the partners to make sure that they can actually see the finishing. Yes.
Mm.
Can the camera? Oh, can see. Right, good. Oh. Oh, I see. They couldn't actually see us on the.
If we turn off the slides.
They could only see the slides. Interesting.
Oh.
That's good.
Okay.
They couldn't see my gestures. Excellent.
Oh, I see. Okay. Let's do that. Okay. Right. Does anyone have any questions online? Anyone at all? If there's any questions you posted, feel free to post them on Facebook in the next 20 minutes while we still have the room. Yes. Before we get kicked out. Yeah. Gotta check Facebook same time. My phone's rather slow. Does anyone actually have a connection to Facebook? That's oh, thank you. If you see any comments being posted on the main post, like questions, then that would be useful, just so that we can make use of the live stream. Ah, very good.
Is that one on the bottom? I can't quite wait whether that's a question or not.
We do. Okay, we have one from a guy called Kimu Stuff. Kimu Stuff says, why did they go from alpha to beta then skip to gamma, then back to delta?
You answer the question.
Okay. Well, because you usually have people who are maybe conquering, who takes it over. It's never so simple as a straight progression. There's all different sorts of things happening that can often cause the system to go back to one stage or another. It's not a perfectly linear theory. It's simply the fact there's lots of different variables and different things happening. And sometimes they may go back to delta. Delta may find themselves, they can actually start conserving their resource rather than expanding, but then that makes them more weak. So suddenly a tribe comes along and takes over and it goes suddenly to beta again.
Yeah, actually.
Then skip to gamma. Oh, so it's a skipping. Oh, okay. So I actually answered the opposite.
Yes.
Oh dear. The question
no, it looks like the question
yes.
is
basically, it follows sort of conceptual idea that versus sort of artistic joy or enjoyment of resources that goes into the sense of nice, friendly community. Eventually, when resources are probably more spare and one needs to then, an essence of competition goes in. So we start trying to, essentially, one group that says we are a certain nation state and we are in competition with another nation state. And then the idea of these people are the enemy and we need to fight together to actually...
yeah, but not only that. I mean, actually, I talked about the enemy, but actually I think, and I think any betas here might see this more attractive way of putting it. What the common thing about beta is a sense of common sense of purpose, right? It's a sense of mission. For instance, when people say we all have to get together to achieve something, a sense of mobilization, this sense of purpose is beta, right? To get together to fight an enemy is just the most obvious, the most primitive one. To mobilize, to fight for, let's say, to mobilize, to eradicate illiteracy or something like that could also be argued as a beta. It is a sense of let's get together to achieve something of a higher meaning than just let's improve our CV, right? Yeah. That is the beta thing, right? The romanticizing of it, right? I can give an example actually, which maybe is closer to, well, a bit closer, another example of this beta to gamma going back to beta, because if anybody here knows French history, I mean, you had the French Revolution, then you had Napoleon, which of course it was a purely beta thing. After Napoleon, we had the Restoration. And in the Restoration, between 1830 to 1848, you had something called the July Monarchy with the King Louis Philippe. And that was the period where France was catching up with Britain with industrialization. And that was maybe the most gamma period of French history. And the ideology of the period was, in French, enrichissez-vous, get rich, right? And that was the most gamma period, with all the gamma characteristics, and the King Louis Philippe was a LAE, as you know. And actually, many French people didn't like that, which is why in 1848, when there was a economic crisis and a revolution, Louis Philippe had to flee, and they went back to put in Napoleon III, with a more mobilizing, more common sense of purpose, more romantic regime, which maybe is what suits the French better, right? So they went for a gamma experiment and didn't like it. Mm. So,
and the Americans saw like the experiment that they did like.
Well, I would argue that what the thing with America is that the people who went there in the first place, in the classic, in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, in the 20th century, were the people who wanted to see that system in the first place. That's the secret of it, in my opinion.
One of the questions are there. Yes. Okay. Rio Taser says, please, so on an alpha civilization, alpha personalities are more adequate, fit, or at ease in it? And so with other types of civilization, so he's asking, by being of a certain personality type that's in line with the culture of that particular time, are you then more at more ease in?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I think so. I think if you are if your quadra coincides what seems to be the quadra of the time, you feel more at home. And if you are and if it is clashes it, you feel sort of, I don't like it, I'm sort of socially not so happy, I want a better world, I want to immigrate, etc. I would argue that the most people who immigrated to the States in the 17th, 18th, were precisely because of this reason, right?
Okay. What else is here? Someone's asked about the Indus Valley civilization.
Okay, I have to pass on that because I have to say, I mean, unfortunately, that's more of a personal thing. I don't know that much about the Indus Valley or about the Chinese, for this matter. I know a little bit about the Chinese, but not about Indus Valley so much. So I cannot say anything specifically about that. I cannot comment intelligently on that, I'm afraid.
Okay, that seems to be all the questions.
Okay.
Right. Thank you very much, Peter.
No problem. Thank you.